For my nephew's 20th birthday, I bought him a new truck. At dinner, he raised his glass and toasted. To my idiot aunt who thinks money buys respect. The whole family laughed. I walked out silently. The next morning, his driveway was empty, and I had 65 missed calls. I bought my nephew a brand new truck for his 20th birthday, thinking it was something kind and solid I could do for him, but at dinner he lifted his glass and said, "To my idiot aunt trying to buy respect with money," and the whole table cracked up, so I didn't argue or explain myself. I just stood up and walked out, and by the next morning his driveway was empty and my phone was blowing up with missed calls. You ever do something nice for someone and instantly regret it the second they open their mouth? Because that was me, Linda, on my nephew Jake's 20th birthday. I'm 40 years old, single, no kids, and honestly that part usually doesn't bother me much because I've built a comfortable life the way I want it. Running a small but steady accounting firm, enjoying quiet weekends unless family gets involved, which always brings its own kind of chaos. My sister Karen, Jake's mom, has had a rough road, since her ex vanished before Jake was even out of diapers, leaving her to raise him alone while juggling 2 jobs. And somewhere along the way she mixed up love with never telling him no. Growing up, Jake was always the loudest person in the room, and at first it was kind of funny and even charming, but once he hit his teen years it was like he realized people would laugh at anything if he said it loudly enough, no matter who he embarrassed along the way. Family dinners slowly turned into full-on roast sessions, and Jake always made himself the host, so I learned to keep my distance, talk less, and give less, even though he was still my nephew and I kept hoping he'd eventually grow out of it. For his 20th birthday I decided to do something big, because he'd been trying to save up for a truck with barely any progress from his warehouse job and side hustles, and I thought that maybe giving him something real and unexpected might change how he saw himself. I didn't tell anyone. I went to the dealership a week before his birthday, paid for everything outright, and had the truck detailed the morning of the dinner. A brand new black Toyota Tacoma that looked like it belonged in a commercial when I parked it down the block. We all gathered at Karen's house where she made lasagna and garlic bread since those were Jake's favorites. Cousins showed up with cheap wine and balloons, uncles brought 6-packs, and someone brought a cake that looked like it had been through a war, making the whole night loud, messy, and very typical for our family. When it came time for gifts, I handed Jake a small box with the keys inside, didn't make a speech, just smiled and nodded toward the driveway, and he opened it, looked confused, then ran outside with everyone following behind. When he saw the truck, he turned back to me with this frozen expression that was half shock and half disbelief. And for a second I thought maybe he finally understood that someone believed in him. Then we went back inside. He grabbed his beer, raised his glass, and made that toast about me. And it felt like someone dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. There was a pause, then real laughter filled the room. Not awkward or uncomfortable laughter, but genuine amusement, with cousins, uncles, and even our grandmother chuckling. And Jake soaked it up like it was exactly what he wanted, while Karen stayed quiet and didn't laugh at all. I didn't laugh either. I just got up, grabbed my coat, and left without making a scene, and that night I barely slept, not because I was angry but because I couldn't shake the disappointment, replaying how easy it was for everyone to laugh at humiliating the person who had just given him a truck, like my dignity didn't really count. At 6:13 the next morning my phone started buzzing with missed calls, one after another, and by 7:30 I had 65 missed calls and a stack of texts, including one from Karen asking where the truck was, which made me smile because by then the driveway was already empty and that was only the beginning. When Jake raised that glass and turned me into a joke, something inside me quietly shut off, not rage or embarrassment but something colder. Like a part of me finally gave up after holding on too long. And I didn't leave to make a point or get chased. I left because I'd accepted a truth everyone else seemed comfortable ignoring. Back at home I didn't cry or yell. I made tea and sat in my kitchen staring at the box where the spare key fob still sat. And sometime around 3 in the morning I grabbed it and drove back to my sister's neighborhood with my headlights off until I was a block away. The truck was still sitting in their driveway exactly where I'd left it, like a reminder of a bad decision, so I got in, started it, and pulled away slowly enough not to wake anyone but fast enough to feel like I was taking something back. I didn't sell it or list it online. I drove it straight home, parked it in my garage, turned off the GPS tracker, and silenced the app connected to Jake's phone, because if he wanted to act like I didn't exist then fine, I wouldn't. At 6:13 that morning my phone buzzed again and didn't stop, and by 7:30 I had 65 missed calls split between Jake and relatives who suddenly discovered their morals after laughing at me the night before, with texts from Jake saying, "Where is it?" Then, "You're insane," and finally, "You're pathetic," none of which I answered. Around 9 I heard tires screech into my driveway and saw Karen's car. with Jake jumping out and slamming the door so hard the mirror shook, pounding on my door for 5 straight minutes until I opened it because I knew he wouldn't leave otherwise. He pushed past me without saying hello and went on a loud rant, calling me delusional and accusing me of making the gift about myself because my life was empty with no partner, no kids, just spreadsheets and a cat. And then he said the one thing I still can't forget, telling me I bought him the truck just so someone would finally depend on me and that it was sad. And before I even thought about it, I slapped him, not hard enough to hurt but hard enough to shock him because the real impact wasn't the hit, it was that I finally did something at all. I told him to get out, plain and simple, and he stood there staring at me like he expected me to apologize or fall apart. But I didn't give him either, so he turned around and left without a word, slamming the door again, and I stood there shaking for a minute, not crying, not feeling weak, just feeling finished. About 20 minutes later my phone rang and it was Karen, asking if Jake had been at my house, and I said yes. Then she told me he'd crashed her car, because right after leaving my place he blew through a yellow light too fast, spun out on a wet road, took out a stop sign and nearly clipped a parked car, completely wrecking the front end of her sedan. He walked away with a few bruises, nothing serious, but it could have been a lot worse, and what stuck with me was that it wasn't even his first crash, just the first time he didn't have an excuse ready. Later that day Karen came over looking exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all, sat down on my couch without touching the tea I made her, and just stared into space before finally saying she didn't think he deserved it and didn't think he deserved anything right now, talking about the truck even though we both knew it went way beyond that. She stayed there almost an hour with her purse still in her lap, hands clenched around the straps like they were the only thing keeping her upright, and I didn't interrupt or try to comfort her because she looked like someone who'd been sleepwalking through years of chaos and had just woken up to the damage. When she finally spoke again, she didn't apologize for Jake or defend him. She just said she thought she'd really messed this up. And I didn't need her to explain because she wasn't just talking about the truck. She told me about the argument after the crash, how Jake came home not shaken or grateful but annoyed, how he didn't apologize or even acknowledge how bad it could have been, instead blaming the road, the rain, the visibility, and then blaming me for making him angry in the first place before somehow turning it all on her. He told her she never let him have anything without strings, that she hovered too much, that she suffocated him like weak parents do, and then said that maybe if she had her life together like I did she could afford to let things slide, and maybe if she'd made better choices he wouldn't be stuck surrounded by idiots. She said her hands were shaking when she yelled back, because it had been years since she'd raised her voice at him after convincing herself it wasn't worth fighting, that he was still growing and figuring things out, but this time she couldn't swallow it. She told him he'd become selfish and mean, that his words didn't make people laugh, they hurt, that he took anything good and twisted it into something bitter, and that he didn't get to talk about respect when he'd never earned any. He rolled his eyes, and when she asked what his dad would say if he saw him right now, she immediately regretted it, because Jake froze, packed a duffel bag, grabbed a cracked phone charger, a hoodie, her spare keys, and walked out. That night he ended up at Aunt Valerie's place, and Valerie has always lived in her own little world with wind chimes in every window, crystals for emotions, and a firm belief that most problems can be solved with herbal tea and sunshine. So she welcomed him without hesitation, set up the guest room, cleared space in the fridge, and even took a day off work to reset the energy in the house with some incense ritual. She texted me the next morning saying he was there and they just needed space, but 3 days later she called again sounding nothing like herself and said we needed to talk about the energy shift in the house, which is Valerie's way of saying everything was falling apart. She told me Jake had been staying out until 2 or 3 in the morning, coming home smelling like beer and fast food, blasting music while she was trying to sleep, dumping dirty clothes in the corner like someone else was supposed to handle it, and when she asked him to help carry groceries he said he wasn't in the mood. When she asked him to vacuum he snapped that he wasn't her kid, and when she mentioned her back hurting and needing help in the yard he laughed and told her to hire someone. She tried to sound calm, but I could hear how shaken she was when she said no one had ever spoken to her like that in her own home. Not even back when she was teaching. I asked if she wanted me to come get him, and after a pause she said no, not yet, but she was giving him a week before he was on his own. After we hung up I went into the garage and looked at the truck sitting there untouched, like nothing had happened, like it was waiting for a different version of Jake. The kid who used to hug me for no reason and once spent an entire afternoon helping me plant tomatoes without being asked. I kept thinking about something Karen told me years ago when Jake was in middle school and got suspended for punching a kid who mocked his worn-out shoes, when she told me he wasn't bad, just loud and hurting, And for a long time I believed that. I think we all did, but being loud and hurting doesn't give you permission to tear through people, wreck cars, humiliate someone who tried to help you, or treat your family like they're beneath you. It doesn't excuse burning every bridge and then acting shocked when you're alone. And the truth is we let it go on too long, laughing at his cruel jokes, rolling our eyes at his excuses, brushing it off as him being young, even though he wasn't that young anymore and he was running out of people willing to make space for the damage. Karen came by the next day looking more like herself than I'd seen in a long time. She looked worn down but steady, and when she glanced at the truck sitting in my garage she said quietly, "Please take it back." Then paused and added that I should never give him anything that big again. Not if he begged, not if he cried, because for once in his life he needed to earn something, and for the first time since all this started I could tell she truly meant it. Early the next morning I called the dealership and told them I wanted to return the truck, and the guy on the phone sounded confused until I gave him the VIN and explained it had barely been driven, no damage, basically still new. And when he warned me about restocking fees, depreciation, and paperwork I told him I didn't care and to just schedule the return. I didn't bring it back right away though because I needed time to think and let everything settle, so the truck stayed in my garage covered with an old canvas tarp from when I painted the spare room, the battery unplugged, sitting there like a sealed-up mistake. That same afternoon there was a knock on my door and I expected Jake or maybe Karen again, but it was Valerie, and she looked completely unraveled, not her usual calm self with scarves and a soft voice, her hair pulled into a careless bun and no attempt at pretending everything was fine. She walked in, dropped her purse on the floor and said he's gone, and when I asked what she meant she told me he left the night before. Took his bag and half the food from her freezer, didn't leave a note, just disappeared and she couldn't reach him. Then she pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket, an old invoice from a local auto shop she hadn't been to in years, saying she didn't even know where it came from, and neither of us understood what it meant until that night. Around 9 I was cleaning the kitchen when I got a FaceTime call from a number I didn't recognize, almost ignored it, but something told me not to. And when I answered it was Jake sitting behind the wheel of my truck with streetlights streaking past behind him, driving way too fast, my stomach dropping instantly. He smiled at the screen like it was all a joke and said I really thought I could just take it away from him, and when I demanded to know how he found it he said spare key, reminding me I'd always kept it in that old tin box, something I hadn't even thought about. I told him to pull over to stop the car, but he ignored me and went on about how everyone acted like he was the problem when he was the only real one, how cutting him off and calling it tough love was just another way of blaming him, and then he looked away. I heard a horn, tires screeching, his face twisted, the screen jolted, and the call went dead. I stood there frozen holding the phone until Valerie called 5 minutes later in a panic, telling me Jake had been in a crash, flying through an intersection, hitting the median, jumping the curb, and slamming into a dumpster behind a shopping plaza, the airbags deploying and the truck completely totaled, crushed front to back. But somehow he walked away with only minor injuries, a fractured wrist, an airbag burn, a few cuts, when it could have been so much worse. The next morning Karen and I went to the hospital, and she looked hollow, saying Jake barely spoke, just stared at the ceiling, doped up on painkillers, and when we went into his room he wouldn't look at me or even acknowledge I was there. His hand wrapped, his face bruised, that same defiance set in his jaw. Karen sat beside him and I stayed by the door, and later she told me what he whispered to a nurse when he thought no one could hear, saying I took everything from him, not talking about the crash or his choices but me. And that was when it really sank in that Jake wasn't just reckless, he genuinely believed his life had been stolen by the people trying to help him. I left the hospital without saying a word to him because by then I understood this wasn't about the truck anymore. It was about every door that had ever been opened for him without question, and the one time someone finally closed one he tried to smash it down. Things could have ended quietly after that, but Jake has never gone quietly, and when he was discharged the next morning Karen brought him home and told him he could stay on the couch for a few days under conditions, no disappearing, no yelling, no blaming everyone else, and for a few hours it looked like he might try, but by midnight he was gone, leaving a note on the back of an envelope saying don't wait up, I'll figure it out. We didn't hear from him for 3 days. Valerie panicked thinking he'd crashed again. Karen texted everyone in his contacts, nothing, until a photo suddenly appeared in the family group chat from Jake with no caption. Just him on a grimy futon holding a half-eaten slice of gas station pizza and smirking like it was all funny. It turned out he was staying with an old high school friend named Jared, a guy with a sketchy apartment above a bait shop 2 towns over, the kind of guy who thought rules were optional and day drinking was a personality trait. Someone he once tried to start a podcast with called Dumb and Real that lasted 3 episodes of conspiracy talk before they quit because editing felt too corporate. Jake always manages to find a couch because he's charming in that fast-talking, self-deprecating way that makes people laugh and second-guess themselves when he crosses a line, buying him time. But even that runs out, and 2 weeks later Valerie texted me to say Jared had kicked him out after Jake screamed at Jared's girlfriend over a spilled drink and broke a lamp. Just like that he was homeless again. No Valerie, no Jared, no Karen, nowhere left to land because after the truck, the crash, the yelling and the disrespect, nobody wanted him around anymore. And he'd smacked into every branch on the way down until there were none left to grab. Karen called me that night with the TV murmuring in the background even though she clearly wasn't watching it, and she said quietly that he'd run out of places to go. And when I didn't answer she added that she wasn't ready to let him back in, not until something actually changed, and I was proud of her for holding that line even though I could already feel that something had started to shift. 3 days later I was locking up my office when a beat-up Ford pulled into the lot, parked crooked with one headlight still on, and I didn't recognize it until the driver's door opened and Jake stepped out with his hoodie pulled low and his movements slower than usual, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. He didn't say hello, just asked if we could talk, so I unlocked the door and let him in, and for once he didn't ask for water, didn't crack a joke, didn't put on that performance he used when he wanted something. He just sat across from my desk staring at his hands before finally saying, "You win." I didn't jump in, and he looked up and said he had nothing now, no car, no place, no money, and no one who trusted him, and that this was exactly what he'd earned, that it took too long but he finally understood, so I waited because I wanted more than a dramatic speech. Then he told me he'd started therapy after Jared's cousin pointed him to a clinic that offered free sessions for people under 25 without insurance, and that he'd already gone twice, which honestly caught me off guard. He said the therapist told him his anger wasn't random, that it came from somewhere, probably his dad leaving and probably never being told no in a way that stuck, and that the guy used a phrase emotional entitlement which Jake admitted he didn't fully understand but hearing it made him feel sick. He said he'd blamed everyone else for years but deep down he thought he was really blaming himself and just never knew how to say it out loud. Then he surprised me again by saying he wanted to pay me back for the truck, not all at once and probably not even in full, but he wanted to try, and that he'd picked up a job at a local garage doing oil changes and tires, nothing glamorous but honest, even holding up his hands to show me the grease under his nails. He said he owed me and he owed a lot of people, but he wasn't asking to move in or borrow money, he just wanted me to know he finally saw it, and for the first time in years he didn't sound like a kid scrambling for an excuse but like someone who'd felt the real cost of his choices. I told him I appreciated him coming by and that if he meant it the best thing he could do was stay steady, not perfect, just steady, and without me prompting him he went straight to Karen's place with his wrists still in a brace and apologized for everything, for using her as a punching bag, for blaming her for what she couldn't fix, for never saying thank you when it mattered. She didn't hug him, she cried and nodded and told him she believed he wanted to be better but wanting wasn't the same as doing. And he said he understood and has been proving it ever since. He sends me a picture of every paycheck and subtracts $25 each time, saying it's not about the amount but about keeping a promise, and he hasn't asked me for anything since, and the best part was last week when he texted me a photo that wasn't food or showing off, just his new therapist card with the words "third session tomorrow" still going. For the first time it wasn't about me or even the truck, it was about him learning not to run when a door closes and figuring out how to knock before trying another one. By the end of that year it felt like Jake was finally becoming someone different, not overnight because nothing about him ever changed fast, but something real had shifted, and his updates came every couple of weeks with small things like more hours at work, another 50 paid back, jokes about how much he still owed, and even a message saying his therapist told him to apologize again, so I was right about all of it. He never asked for money or hinted about moving in, stayed with a coworker for a while, then rented a tiny room above the garage with no kitchen or closet, but his own key, and no one cleaning up after him. It wasn't some clean redemption story because he still messed up, missed therapy once, lost his temper with a customer and almost got fired, but instead of turning it into a joke or a sob story he owned it and talked about it like someone who actually wanted to improve. Meanwhile Karen and I started talking more, not just about him but about memories and plans, and I realized how much our relationship had revolved around Jake for years, what he needed and what he broke, and now that he was out of the house and trying to fix his own life there was finally space for us to just be sisters again. One night she called me out of the blue with no agenda, said she'd taken a real vacation day for the first time in years and gone hiking alone, and admitted she'd spent so long afraid he'd fall apart without her that she forgot she could stand on her own, which really stuck with me. Then something happened none of us expected when Jake's dad reached out after hearing about the crash, saying he'd changed and wanted to meet, all the usual words after 20 years of silence, And Karen told Jake but made it clear she wouldn't push him either way. He took almost a week to respond before saying that if his dad wanted to talk he could come to therapy with him for one session. And when Karen forwarded me that message she added that she didn't know where this version of him came from but she was finally truly proud. They went to that one session and Jake didn't come out glowing with forgiveness, but later over coffee he told me it helped, that his dad cried more than he did, which felt strange but oddly satisfying, and then he said he wasn't as angry as he thought he'd be, just tired of walking around in clothes that never fit and finally figuring out what was actually his. It's been almost a year since the toast, the truck, and the crash, and he still doesn't have a car and hasn't paid me back fully, which I honestly don't care about anymore because what matters is that he's showing up to his life now, one session, one paycheck, and one moment at a time. The last time I saw him we were standing outside the garage when he wiped his hands on his work shirt and asked if we were good now, me and him, and I really looked at him before saying we were getting there. And he nodded and smiled, not that old smirk but something quiet and real, then went back to work, and for the first time in years I walked away without waiting for the next disaster. Because this time I didn't see a boy running from the truth, I saw a man finally facing it.